to Conversing the Classics, a Classical Youth Society of Ireland podcast dedicating to discussing classics with the subject's experts. My name's Oscar and I'm the founder and chair of CYSI. Today's topic is the Minoans, the ancient civilization of the Aegean. Introducing me to the Minoans today is Dr. Christine Morris, an archaeologist and associate professor in Greek archaeology in Trinity College, Dublin. Christine, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for asking me, Oscar.
So I suppose firstly, as a general introduction, who are the Minoans?
Okay, well, the Minoans is a term that we use to describe the people that lived on the island of Crete in the Bronze Age. So they're Bronze Age Cretans.
Okay, and when you say Bronze Age, roughly what time frame are they inhabiting Crete?
So the time frame is in the distant past. It's from around 3000 BC to around 1000 BC.
So that they're around quite a while.
Yeah, they're long-lived civilization, but it's what we call the prehistoric period.
And why are they called the Minoans? And do we know if they called themselves the Minoans?
That's a good question. They certainly didn't call themselves Minoans. It's a made-up modern scholarly term, and it came into common use. It was used by Sir Arthur Evans, who is the excavator of the most important large Minoan site of Knossos. And because we don't know what they called themselves, he coined the term. It's taken from Greek mythology and from King Minos, who was the lawgiver of Crete, famously associated with Knossos, and it came into popular usage. So we use it for convenience. We do have some idea of what they might have called themselves, but that comes from Egyptian evidence. So contemporary with the Minoans, New Kingdom Egypt, and we see pictures of people who are dressed like Minoans and carry Minoan objects in wall paintings from the Theban tombs. And it talks about these people coming from the Great Green, which means that they lived in the middle of the sea, and the word used for them is keftiu. So that would be the closest we're ever going to get. I think it might be what they called themselves. Okay,
and what are the major archaeological sites that you'd look at when you were looking at the Minoans?
Well, I guess I already mentioned the most famous, the one that anyone who knows about the Minoans would have heard of, is Knossos. So Knossos is both the biggest and most important site, and it was the earliest one to be explored and excavated. So it's in north central Crete, near to where you arrive in Heraklion, the modern capital. And it's a palace, by which we mean a large, complex structure, which is the focus of power in the civilization, and it's one of a number of palaces, but it's 4 times bigger than any of the others. The other palaces are called Festos, Malia, Zakro in the far east of Crete. So that gives us a picture that it's not one large kingdom, it's a series of competing, what we call competing polities. There is sort of series of palatial territories which are each competing with each other. So a little bit like later Greek city-states. It's not one united kingdom.
But is there any evidence to suggest that at any one point in the history that the kingdom was united under one person?
No, there really isn't, except that as the civilization develops, so it's around 2000 BC that the palaces emerge as this kind of powerhouse, what we call the rise of complex society. And at first they seem to be just competing with each other. Some people believe that as time went on, that Knossos became the most powerful, but scholars, as with many things, debate and discuss and disagree about that. As well as the palaces, which if you think of society as like a pyramid, the palaces are at the top with the rulers, the elite controlling all kinds of things. And then below that you've got towns, there are villas or country houses, and then different sorts of types of sites. And we know a lot about the different sorts of sites. We have a whole town that's been excavated in eastern Crete. It's a site called Gunia, and it's an ordinary town. You can walk up the little cobbled streets, see into the houses, and it was excavated early in the 20th century by an American, a female archaeologist. There's something very rare at the time called Harriet Boyd Hawes, and the American School of Classical Studies are re-excavating it now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right. And do the sites themselves, I mean, in terms of building style, do they look anything like the Greek temples that we would be so familiar with, or are they totally different architecturally?
I'd say they'd be totally different. One of the interesting things is that when the palaces first started to come to light and scholars would have seen plans of them, they talked about them being a chaotic jumble, of being labyrinthine, and I think that was the classical viewpoint being placed on them, that this looked like a mess compared to the orderly temples and so on. So there's a different mental template of space and architecture, really different.
And what kind of materials are the palaces made on? Is it marble or is it...
So taking Knossos as an example, it's built, what survives that we see today that's original is stone, but what you have to remember is what's not there. So there would have been a lot of wood being used as well, which obviously doesn't survive. And actually they were quite good at building, using wood within the structure of the buildings to resist earthquake.
Oh, wow.
Because that would have been a really big problem. So we can see the way that wooden beams are built into the architecture to try. They weren't always successful. The palaces did fall down in earthquakes, but definitely that. And then at Knossos, there's a special kind of material used, which is called gypsum. And gypsum is what modern plaster of Paris is made from. And it comes from the hill of Gypsardas, which is behind Knossos. And that's like a soft kind of limestone. And it would give the same effect as marble when you face architecture with it. It would give a lovely polished reflective effect. So they're really interested in nice, aesthetically pleasing materials in their buildings.
Brilliant. And I suppose, when does modern scholarly views in the Minoans start? I mean, when are these sites first discovered and how are they first discovered?
Okay, the Minoans are one of those civilizations that I guess fascinate people because they're a rediscovered lost civilization. They only come through in Greek writings. I mean, the Greeks didn't know who they were. They survived in myth, which we might talk about later. But they're rediscovered in the late 19th century. People start to kind of pick up artifacts and to recognise that this is something that doesn't match anything we already know about. And the key figure there is Sir Arthur Evans, who was a British scholar and archaeologist from a very academic family. His father, John Evans, was a famous antiquarian as well. And Evans was travelling around and he was given objects, small tiny seal stones, which would be little miniature objects made of semi-precious stone that would be used for marking objects, kind of recording system. And they had little signs on them and he recognised it was a script that was unknown. So a little bell must have gone off in his head and said, unknown script, unknown lost civilization. And he then went and travelled around Crete, first of all, in the late 19th century and collected up a lot of objects, and afterwards he bought up the land at Knossos ready to excavate it. So he's one of the key, really interesting figures. And then other early archaeologists started to work at other sites such as Festos and Malia. And one of the characteristics of archaeology in Greece and in Crete is almost a kind of colonialist idea that's carved up between the British, the French, the Italians, the Germans. They had these long traditions of scholarship. So these sites were all being competed for and excavated by these different scholars. So there was quite intense interest in it and a big excitement when it was first found, because the architecture, the finds were completely different from anything anyone had ever seen before.
And you mentioned there that they have their own form of script. Have we deciphered this script? You said it's an unknown language. Do we have any idea of what they are writing about?
Okay, so the Aegean and Crete is quite rich in scripts. There are 3 different scripts. There's something called Cretan hieroglyphic, which has no connection with Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's just a kind of picture writing, so that was what Evans called it. There's also Linear A, which is derived from it. We can't read either of those in the sense that they're not deciphered. They're written in an unknown language, but we can say something about what they're about because we can get a sense that they're records, they're counting things. It's an accounting system for the economy of the palace, and in some cases they also seem to be religious formulae or incantations that are incised on objects. So writing is being used in the same way as it is in a lot of early civilizations. The 2 sides, the practical side of life, let's record everything so we can tax things, monitor what people are doing, and the other side, the religious or spiritual side of life, to communicate with the supernatural. So those are two scripts. The third script is Linear B, which is perhaps the one that people would have heard of. That is derived from Linear A. It's the same script, but it's a different language, and that language is Greek. So that has been deciphered very famously in the 1950s and associated with Michael Ventris, then British scholar who deciphered it and discovered it was Greek. It's hard to imagine now that up until then, for the whole half century before, the first Linear B tablets were found by Evans at Knossos, actually the first year he excavated. And it took all of that time to work out what this language was and to be able to read it. So it's actually Greek written in a different script from the way Greek was later written.
Wow. And how did he go about deciphering it? How did he...
Well, one of the things he couldn't do, if you want to decipher something or break its code, it's quite convenient to go from the known to the unknown. So the very famous example of that would be the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone allowed scholars to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs because it was a document that was written also in Greek saying the same thing, so they were able to go from known to unknown. We don't have that with Linear B, but he was able to decipher it by creating grids and analysing it. But a nice thing to mention here, and as we're recording, we're in International Women's Week in March 2016, and it was a woman American scholar who very few people have heard of, Alice Kober, who created the framework or the grid that allowed him to draw the inference that was Greek. And she did that by taking all of the tablets and the signs and creating grids and looking for patterns and repetition. And she worked out that it had to be a language which linguists would call inflected. So a language where the ending changes, whether it's singular, plural, masculine, or feminine. So anyone listening who learns Spanish or Italian or even Latin will know what I mean. And they found that the end of the word changes, so they were able, that narrowed what it could possibly be. And she was the one to work that out. And it's quite a sad story. She died tragically in 1950, and her work then was the building blocks on which Ventris was able to announce the decipherment 2 years later. So it's a nice story.
Yeah. And I suppose then going back to the ancient Minoans, we spent a bit of time in the 1950s there.
Go back in time again.
Back in time a little bit. How similar are the Minoans to the traditional classical Greeks that we're all so familiar with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say very different in many ways. I suppose a starting point would be the structure of society. So when we think of classical Greece, we think of the city-state, the polis, perhaps classical Athens, things like that. And I suppose the difference is that the thing at the heart of the structure isn't the polis or the city-state, it's the palace. It's that kind of elite mechanism of rulers and aristocrats. But that was the form of civilization all through the Mediterranean at that time. So if you think of the pharaohs of Egypt, the Hittite kings of Anatolia, modern Turkey, or the rulers of the Near East, that's the kind of world that these people are living in. And sometimes people call it the first international period because it's a period of time, especially in the second millennium from 2000 BC onwards, when the rulers of these kingdoms and states were all in contact with each other, trading, diplomatic exchange, intermarriage, and so on.
Yeah, but I suppose then to sort of relate those two questions together about the decipherment of Linear B and the knowledge of how different they are to the modern Greeks, how much writing do we have, how much Linear B writing do we have from the time, and how much does it tell us about life for the Minoans?
Okay, so for the Minoans, it only gives an indirect view because, as I said, Linear B is Greek, and I suppose I should have been more explicit that the reason we can't decipher the Minoan Linear A is because the Minoans are not Greeks. They're non-Greek speaking, and there's a little bit of a mystery about where they first came from when the island was first colonised, but they're not speaking an Indo-European language. So there's something totally interesting. Different. There's something kind of still mysterious about them. And the tablets found at Knossos, which are written in Greek, belong to the time of Mycenaean influence. So we know a lot about the Mycenaeans, and we know that they had a ruler whose title was a wanax, and we know the structure of their society. We can reconstruct, if you like, the pyramid from the ruler through to the elite. They have a sort of class of people who are called eketai, who are like the cavalry class, right down to the people who are servants or slaves, and descriptions of everything they do. But that's a Mycenaean world. And the Minoan world could be quite similar, but I suspect that there are important differences. So we don't know whether there's a single ruler and a ruling group. We don't have any what we call ruler iconography. There are no images we can associate with a ruler or a king.
And I suppose that we have all this, and you were talking there about the lower classes. Are there any sort of indications that they traded in slaves and that they had slaves, or was it just sort of almost medieval, where you had a lower class and an upper class, and the lower class served the upper class?
I think those kinds of questions are really difficult to answer when you're talking about prehistory and you're dealing mostly with archaeology. For Linear B and the Mycenaeans, we can say a little bit about that, because we have got these large numbers of people who are being recorded as working for the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland, and they receive rations in return for their labour. So depending on your point of view, they could be slaves, or they're certainly indentured and they're within the control of the palaces. You might infer that any society that's as hierarchical as this, way, you know, you can gather labour to build palaces. You've got people making beautiful artefacts from rare materials like gold and ivory and so on in the palaces. That it's a hierarchical system where some people are working for others. So I think that that's very clear. And I think it's only been in more recent times that people have started to take more interest in what the lives of, if you like, more ordinary people were like out in the landscape beyond the palaces.
It seems that almost their system, from the way that you tell it, seems a little bit similar to the medieval system, where you had serfs as opposed to slaves.
It could be that. I don't think we can really tell.
Say,
No, but what we can tell is that the palaces have a lot of economic control over their territories. As you might expect, if you are a powerful palace, you've got to have economic, political and religious control ways of it. So all early states have this mixture of ways of keeping and legitimating their power over others.
And you mentioned there a few minutes ago about all these beautiful artifacts being made in the palace. In terms of when you go to excavate a Cretan site, are there any reoccurring artifacts that are constantly found on Minoan archaeological sites?
I think there are lots of things. The most common thing that you would find on any Minoan site or anywhere in the Mediterranean is pottery. So if you're sitting digging in Ireland, pottery is quite a rare thing to find, but you would find thousands and thousands of pieces of pottery which are important for dating, and also they give us information about the kinds of activities they do. Are they feasting? Are they storing objects, which they do in huge objects we call pithoi, which are like Alibaba jars, big enough that you could get inside for storage. So their skills in pottery are they would be found on every single site. Precious objects made from ivory, gold and things like that tend to be found more in graves, because that's where they are preserved and they haven't been robbed or destroyed. I suppose the kind of object I would have a special place for me is some of the work that I do in collaborating with Dr. Alan Peatfield at UCD. We work together, would be on peak sanctuaries, which is one of the religious types of sites that they go and do rituals and worship on the tops of mountains. And there are plenty of mountains. If anyone's been to Crete, they'll know it's a very mountainous landscape. And one of the things we know they did, they bring clay figurines, handmade clay figurines, thousands of them are found on the top of these mountains. So that would be a type of object which is precious in a different way from gold or ivory. It's precious because it's an ordinary object, an everyday object that most people would have had access to and used and brought to these sites.
And what do these clay figurines then usually depict?
Okay, so the clay figurines are little representations that you could hold in your hand, usually in size, and they depict men and women, so they're what we call anthropomorphic in human form, and then also lots of different types of animals, such as cattle, sheep, goats, and that kind of thing. So they represent things that matter to the people who are offering them. And one of the purposes of these sites is as a place to make offerings to do with health and well-being. So it's to do with individual people's health, so still a great concern of religion today, to be well, to be healthy, to be cured from illness, but also the well-being and fertility of their flocks as well. That's part of what's going on.
But you've got a pile of sort of reconstructed ones over there. I'll take a picture of them and use them as the thumbnail for the podcast, I think. So this is obviously related to their religious practices. What do we know about their religion?
Okay, one of the things we know a lot about is what we'd call ritual action. So we can reconstruct from archaeological finds a lot of the things they do. So we know that they practice animal sacrifice, they practice the pouring of liquid offerings, which is called libation, that they have processions and performances. So we can see a lot about what they're doing. A different and more difficult thing in the absence of literature is what they believed in, so their actual spiritual beliefs. And that's a little bit more of a difficult one. By the time we get to the late Bronze Age and we have these Linear B tablets we were talking about, which we can read, we can see there a point of contact with later Greece, something very familiar to everyone. They are polytheistic. They believe in many gods. So you've got the Olympian pantheon. So you have gods and goddesses named in the tablets who are some of the same ones, so Zeus, Poseidon and so on. Also lots of gods that don't make it through to later periods, they seem to disappear. So there are differences, but it's very difficult to associate specific divinities with any of the rituals. So for example, on the peak sanctuaries, we can see what they're doing, but there's no direct reference to whom it's directed. And so some people, a very traditional belief which comes down, scholarly belief that is, which comes down from Evans, is the idea of a great Minoan goddess, a mother goddess. So that's something I have a particular interest in, goddesses. But, you know, trying to pin that down is a very complex thing. But there are probably many goddesses, but one of the things that's really visible in Minoan archaeology, in all the different art forms, is females who are priestesses or goddesses on gold rings, on frescoes and in the art. So
we have a decent amount to suggest that obviously they worshipped female gods. I suppose in terms of that, do we have any idea specifically why people brought these figurines up to the mountaintop sanctuaries? I mean, is it just that they were a high place and they were associated with worship, or is there something to do with health or something like that they wanted good health and it was closer to the gods?
I think that the idea, if you like, the phenomenon of going up to a mountain is cross-culturally quite important in society. So some of the later Greeks, Zeus, for example, was worshipped on the mountain top. So that idea of being, whether it made them close to divinity, I don't know, because that assumes that you think of deities as being up there somewhere. So the other thing they also do, as well as going to the top of mountains, is they go into caves. Crete is, the mountains are mainly limestone, and so it's riddled with wonderful caves full of spectacular stalagmites and stalactites. So they're doing both. It's almost like they're the extremes of the natural world in which they live. So I think that there is an idea, which you find in other societies as well, that the world of the supernatural, the other, the non-ordinary reality, is somehow more easily connected with at the top of the mountain or in the depths of the cave, away from ordinary space. So that could be what's going on. Why they leave the objects there, I think that again is something that you can see. A modern analogy of it, a very simple one, which I think would be familiar to most people, is the idea of lighting a candle in church. So we call that a votive candle. So you light the candle, and the light and the physicality of the candle is a reminder or a prompt that you have been there, that you have made your offering, made your request. And leaving a votive offering in a sanctuary is doing the same thing. It's a kind of physical reminder that you were there and that you made these prayers and interacted in ritual. So it's permanently left there to represent that.
And I suppose then, again, to sort of talk a little bit about the clay figures themselves, do we know if the people going to the top of these mountains would have made them themselves before they went up, or would there have been a specific person in the village who you would go to and ask for what you want made and they would make it?
I think that's an interesting question if you're interested in how social organisation works in that way. So from our work in Western Crete, where we've excavated a very rural peak sanctuary called Atsipades in the Rethymnon area, we're very clear that they're locally made because they're made from the same clay as the pottery, but that they are probably made by the potters. We've done, Oscar was referring to things on the floor of my office, little figurines, so we've done quite a lot of experimental work trying to replicate the ways the figurines are made. And it does take a certain amount of skill, and they are quite stylized as well, so you can see, if you like, the hands or the style of particular people who made certain figurines. And in addition to which, you can see that the style of the figurines is different in different areas of Crete. So it's a really nice example of kind of local ways of doing things, which again brings back to ordinary people rather than the central power of the palaces.
Brilliant. I suppose then, just on sort of a more personal note, what's your favourite thing that you've ever excavated while in Crete? I mean, be it a figurine or a site or...
Oh, okay, that's not the question I was expecting you to ask me. You were going to ask me what my favourite object was.
Your favourite find, or your favourite...
So those would be two different things. I'll talk about my favourite find because I thought about that. It's a bit like Desert Island Discs, isn't it? Having to choose something. It's really hard.
What album would you bring back to the Bronze Age?
Wow. No, don't ask me that. Don't ask me that. I have to think a bit more about that. My favourite object is actually not something I excavated, but it's something I've loved ever since I started doing Minoan archaeology. And it's a box or a circular pyxis. It's a box that would have been used to put things in, and it's made from a soft stone called chlorite, and it's carved, and on the lid of the box there is a dog, and the dog is lying down with its paws stretched out and its back paws stretched to the side, sort of like dogs do when they're completely chilled out and relaxed. And I absolutely love it because I love dogs. And, you know, again, it's that sort of human aspect of them representing not just themselves, but the animals that are their companions. So I'm very fond of it. And it's called, the object's from a site called Moklos. So it's the Moklos dog.
And then, not to put you under pressure, but what's your favourite thing that you've excavated yourself, that you've taken out of the ground?
I would say it's the figurines from the Peak Sanctuary, because I kind of, you know, living with them in terms of research and thinking about them, and that's a long-term project that we've been doing since 1989, so it's a long time being thought of and reflecting on it. And the most recent thing we've been doing is that we've been doing laser scanning of the objects and making 3D prints of them. So that's a kind of example of how what we can do with these objects that are so old changes with new technologies. So the if you like, the dialogue between the past and what we can do now is ever changing as well. And
you mentioned earlier that the name for the Minoans comes from a particular point in mythology. I suppose, to expand on that, what sort of mythology is associated with the Minoans, both in classical Greece and I suppose in modern scholarly studies? Well,
as we said, King Minos is the source of the word Minoan, and the famous myth then that King Minos lived in his palace at Knossos, and the famous story associated with him is the story of the Minotaur, where Daedalus builds the labyrinth for King Minos to trap the Minotaur, who's part bull, part man, who's the result of, I'm not know to say it on radio, the unnatural union between Pasiphae, who's Minos' wife, and the bull that's sent by Poseidon. So it's a hybrid monstrous creature, and it's cannibalistic. It eats human beings, so it's trapped in the labyrinth. And in the famous story, Theseus comes from Crete with the youths and maidens of Athens, and he rescues them from the labyrinth with the help of the princess Ariadne. So I think it's a very famous story, the story of the Minotaur. And it's one of those sort of, you know, myths don't reflect reality in an exact way, but it's sort of like it's like glimpsing through sort of a dark glass
Yeah.
or a thread of something from the past. So bulls are really important. There's a lovely book by someone called Roberto Calasso called The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, and he has this phrase which I think is very lovely, and he says there's a bull at the beginning and end of every Cretan story. So there are other stories with bulls. Everybody knows the story of the labours of Heracles.
Yeah.
So one of the labours where he goes south down to Crete, he brings back the Cretan bull, he captures it, and that Cretan bull is the bull that in the next sort of generation that Theseus captures on the plain of Marathon and brings back and sacrifices. So that this Cretan bull gets around quite a bit. The idea of the bull is there.
Yeah.
The other very famous mythical association of Crete is with the birth of Zeus. So Zeus is born in a Cretan cave, hidden there by his mother to save him from his being sort of swallowed and destroyed by his father. And so that's an interesting thing. We said that caves are a place where religious ritual takes place. So the cave is the earth, it's like Gaia, and so he's saved by being kept inside the earth, and then when he grows he comes and of course overthrows his father and establishes the rule of the Olympian gods. And some people would see in that story a reflection of the way that religion developed. So the idea that the Olympian order, which is it's got gods and goddesses, but it's pretty patriarchal at heart, that underlying that in this story of the birth and so on is some traces of an earlier period where female deities were more important, powerful, and that this links the two together within the cave in Crete.
So I suppose then you mentioned there that obviously mainland Greece had a lot sort of owed, I suppose, to not the Minoans but Crete itself as an island. Is there much evidence to suggest that the Minoans had trade with mainland Greece?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you think of the Mycenaeans in the shaft graves and their great citadels later on, it's very likely none of that would have happened without the Minoans, because it was the catalyst of Minoans already living in palaces, already having complex civilization, that has the knock-on effect of pushing the Mycenaeans to that stage as well. So it's what sometimes people call secondary state formation, to use the jargon. And they're very influenced by Minoan technologies and arts. So Mycenaean palaces have frescoes and wall paintings. Those technologies are all taken over from the Minoans. So lots of Minoan influence and lots of trade back and forth as well, definitely.
Right. I suppose then that the fact that they were trading with mainland Greece, obviously they were an island. Do we have any evidence of shipbuilding or of ships being built and used and how they went about that? Or is that something that's gone?
Well, I think that's something that we're in the process of finding out more about. It's extremely clear from the archaeological evidence that the Minoans are out and about in the Aegean, because we find Minoan objects and we find Minoan influence, economic and cultural influence, all over the Aegean. There are standard weighing systems. The Linear A tablets are found on other Aegean islands. So if you like, the Minoans are culturally dominant in the palace periods in the Aegean. And there are images of ships in their art, and most recently there have been some underwater archaeology has found remains of Minoan ships. So I think it's a case of watch this space, we will be learning more about that.
And how big are these ships? Are they full people carriers, or are they little sort of rowboats?
Oh, they would be ships that could do long distance trade.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a little bit later on from the Mycenaean period, there's a very famous wreck called the Uluburun or Kash shipwreck that was found sunk off the coast of Turkey. It's one of the richest shipwrecks that's ever been found, and it had tons of copper ingots and things. It gives us a real insight into, as I said, this international period. Lots of stuff is being moved around, especially copper. And copper is the oil of the ancient world. It was something you couldn't manage without. You needed it to make bronze, to make tools, to make weapons, to make vessels, all sorts of things. So there's a lot of trade and shipping going around, and the evidence suggests quite sophisticated skills in shipbuilding. So yes, full large size
I suppose
ships.
there you mentioned copper. We're in the Bronze Age. Obviously Crete was very wealthy in the Bronze Age. do we have any evidence that there were tin or copper mines on the island of Crete?
No, there aren't. So the way that we find out where the raw materials for making bronze, so bronze is made from 90% copper, 10% tin, you need to acquire those raw materials from somewhere. And the way that we can be fairly sure where they came from is through doing scientific work called lead isotope analysis, and that's been done on a lot of the actual ingots, the raw material of copper, and on finished objects. So the key source, which will be a surprise to nobody, is the island of Cyprus, and the word Cyprus comes from the word Cyprium, which is the word for copper. So that has very extensive copper mines, and the trade from Cyprus through the Aegean is very, very important. But there are also copper mines at Laurion or Lavrion in Attica, which is more famous for the silver mines in the later classical period, but it also has copper. So there are more locally available sources, but it's a really important resource. And it's one of the things that once trade breaks down towards the end of the Bronze Age, that, you know, they're having trouble getting hold of it. It's an essential resource.
And where is it then that they get their tin from?
That's more problematic, and there are all sorts of theories about that, but probably further through Anatolia and further away, but not necessarily from the same places as the copper.
So I suppose then, how are they so wealthy? What allowed them to become such sort of a wealthy, not so much superpower, but definitely an influence in the Bronze Age? I
think there are probably a number of different reasons for that. One would be that once you've established enough resources internally to build palaces, and you've got the resources to employ artisans and so on, that other people want to emulate what you have. So it's what we would think of as cultural emulation or Minoanization. All the areas around about copy Minoan pottery, you see styles of the art that are copied, so they're influential culturally and also economically. So there's a sort of spread of their cultural values. But when you try to think about how do they maintain that power in any society, it's to do with economic control over their landscape, that they are producing things, they're storing things. The palaces have huge storage areas where they're storing goods, they're producing precious objects. So part of it is economic control, but in pretty much every ancient society that's combined with some sort of ritual or religious control. So it's the idea that comes down to us in later societies as the divine right of kings. So the idea that, you know, that's the thing, it's very difficult to challenge somebody claiming that they're descended from the gods or that they've got a divine right to rule. And the big emphasis on ritual and religion in their art suggests that that's pretty central to what's going on.
Now, I suppose they were obviously quite prominent on the trading scene. Is there any evidence to suggest that they had an army or any sort of military defence force or anything?
That is a good question, because anyone who's heard of the Minoans tends to think of them as being peace-loving, flower-loving, that kind of thing. It's a kind of popular image that's come through of them, which is partly propagated by Evans himself, and recent scholarship has suggested that was a reaction to the horrors of war in the early 20th century, to want to look to a kind of utopian age when things were more peaceful and better. And it is true that there's a lot of beauty and nature in their art. It is also the case that they were warlike to some extent. They had very good technology of weapons. They developed swords, which were then copied by the Mycenaeans, and they do have roads and fortifications. They're just much less obvious than the kinds that we would see, for example, in Hittite strongholds or Mycenaean citadels. They appear more peaceful and less militaristic than the Mycenaeans, but clearly to have been that influential in the Aegean, they had to have the potential to enforce what they were doing. So I think it's a misconception to think of them as being peaceable.
And I suppose then, obviously you mentioned that there were sort of almost policies of different palaces round Crete. Is there any evidence to suggest that there ever was conflict or fighting between them, or even fighting between one of these palaces and the mainland? Or is that's just hazy?
I think it's probably a bit hazy, but there's certainly evidence for conflict, and I mean there are quite a lot of destruction horizons, which of course is bad news for the people who lived then, but good news for the archaeologist, because it preserves lots of things. So definitely there is internal factional conflict between different areas. That is definitely there in the record. Yeah.
And then obviously so much has been excavated. You've been heavily involved with excavating sites on Crete. Are there many more archaeological sites left to be excavated on Crete, or has it largely been?
There is always more to find. There's almost more to find to surprise us. You know, single things can change our ideas of what's going on. So there are so many archaeological sites everywhere in Greece, and I'm sure that there will be new things that will surprise and delight us.
And how often are you back and forth sort of excavating in Crete, or is that something that you've sort of stopped doing in recent years, or is it?
We're not involved in physical digging at the moment, but we have projects in Crete, so we go out at least once a year.
Oh, brilliant.
And with the kind agreement of the Greek archaeological authorities, we're very able to work in museums and to work on our objects and so on. So, but we lived there. I lived at Knossos, not in the palace, obviously, but in the British School of Archaeology with Alan. We lived there for 6 years, working for the British School. So Crete has a very sort of special place in my heart, not just the Minoans, but the modern Crete as well.
And approximately then what era, sort of coming to the end of the Minoans, approximately what era does the Minoan civilization start to decline?
Minoan civilization within a wider context of the Aegean and the whole Eastern Mediterranean declines or collapses around 1200 BC. That's a ballpark figure, but we talk about the collapse of the Bronze Age, and that is no exaggeration, because what happens is that in Crete and mainland Greece, all through the Hittite Empire, the Near East and Egypt, something goes horribly, really horribly wrong then. And I think a recent writer who's written a super book about it, Eric Klein, he's come up with this idea. He calls it a perfect storm of things going wrong. And I think that really captures it, because it isn't just any one thing. There's certainly warfare between different areas. There seem to be economic and climatic problems. So when people are talking about collapse scenarios, with different empires, the Mayans, Han China, the Romans, and so on, you're always looking at these things coming together in a bad way, I suppose. Everything going wrong, a kind of house of cards that collapses. And it's one of the most extreme collapses that you see, and it's followed by what we then call the Dark Ages of Greece. So they lose Linear B, the palaces disappear, all the arts and things, skills that they have in the Bronze Age are pretty much lost for several hundred years until you then get the re-emergence of Greece as most people know it.
Okay, and what are the three, if you could pick only three, this is always whoever does the podcast, they always hate this question. What are the three most important things you'd like people to remember about Minoan civilization?
Okay, I think first of all, what I'd like people to remember or find out more about is the grace and beauty of the actual artefacts, the art, because even from the time when it was first found, people were astounded by it. It looked really different from Egyptian art, later Greek art, the grace, the beauty, the technological skills. So I think that would definitely be one thing, the visual side of things. When we
upload this onto our YouTube channel, I'll get Michael to add in sort of a line of nice pictures of things like Knossos.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that just the beauty, the physical beauty of their material world. The second thing is a slightly different thing, and that is that I think it's important to think of the Minoans not as flower lovers, but as people who are in tune with or really inhabiting their kind of landscape, both from the point of view of people who worship on mountains and in caves, but their art is full of plants and animals, and the animal world is used as a kind of metaphor, as a tool for thinking about their worldview, their cosmology. So I think that for us, thinking environmentally and so on, that's a kind of very evocative aspect of them. And then the third thing is something slightly different, and that is that what I'd like people to take away is a desire to go and visit Crete and see the Minoans. The archaeological sites are very impressive. The Heraclean Museum has been recently refurbished, and it's a stunningly beautiful museum full of all the treasures of Minoan civilization. And I guess, at this time we need people to go to Greece for their holidays to support them. So that's a slightly different third wish.
Yeah. Well, that brings us nicely to the end of the podcast. Christine, thank you very much for joining me today. If you enjoyed today's podcast and want to find out more or get involved with Classical Youth Society of Ireland, you can contact us via our social media pages on facebook.com/Classical Youth Society Ireland, Twitter @CYSI_, or for any direct inquiries you can email us cysiofficial@gmail.com. Today's podcast was produced by myself and edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all next time.